Scary telling.
I had been driving for hours through the dark and desolate Nevada highway with nothing but the sound of my music to keep me company. As I started to feel more and more tired, my eyelids grew heavy and I struggled to stay awake. Suddenly, a voice from the back seat startled me awake. I was confused and scared by the presence of someone in my car. As I turned to look at the stranger, I could see that he was dressed like an American tourist, but his face was obscured by shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but I couldn't seem to escape the stranger's presence. I rolled down the window for some fresh air, but it didn't help. In fact, it only seemed to make the stranger more agitated. The stranger remained silent, but I could feel his eyes on me, and I became increasingly nervous and paranoid. I couldn't see his face in the darkness, and the more I thought about it, the more frightened I became. Eventually, I decided to pull over to see what the stranger wanted. I turned to face him, but he gave no response. Instead, I realized that he had no tongue. This discovery only added to my fear and confusion. As I got back on the road, I was left feeling unsettled and scared. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was deeply wrong and that I was in grave danger. With each passing mile, I felt increasingly trapped and alone. My heart raced as I drove down the dark highway, wondering what would happen next. The stranger remained silent, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The longer I drove, the more certain I became that I had made a grave mistake in pulling over to talk to the stranger. My mind raced with questions, but I knew that there would be no answers until it was too late. Despite my fear and unease, I found myself following the stranger's instructions. He started to speak, giving me directions to follow. I felt a strange compulsion to obey, despite my fear. As we continued down the highway, I began to feel a sense of transformation coming over me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was becoming someone else entirely. It was as if the stranger's presence was affecting me on a fundamental level. We passed through empty towns and billboards, with nothing but darkness and silence surrounding us. As we drove further down the highway, I felt increasingly trapped by the stranger's influence. It was as if I had no choice but to follow his commands, even though I knew that doing so could lead to disaster. Despite my fear, I continued to follow the stranger's instructions. It was as if I was trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to escape the strange, hypnotic pull of his voice. As the night wore on, I found myself growing increasingly desperate to escape the stranger's grasp. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to break free of his influence. I was trapped in a world of darkness and despair, with no way out. By the time we had driven for what felt like hours, I was completely lost. I had no idea where we were or where we were going. All I knew was that I was trapped and that I couldn't escape the stranger's influence. As the night wore on, I started to feel more and more like I was losing my grip on reality. It was as if I was slipping into some kind of alternate universe, one where nothing made sense and nothing was as it seemed. Despite my fear and confusion, I continued to follow the stranger's commands. It was as if I had no choice but to obey, no matter what the consequences might be. As we drove deeper into the night, I felt a sense of dread and terror building inside of me. I knew that I was in deep trouble and that there was no way out. As we drove deeper into the night, I began to realize the full extent of my situation. I was trapped by the stranger's influence, and there was no way out. The stranger's voice echoed in my mind, haunting me forevermore. I was forced to confront the reality of my situation and the fact that I may never escape his grasp. As we drove through the empty towns and billboards, I was left feeling scared, alone, and unsure of what the future held. As the night wore on, I began to feel a deep sense of hopelessness. I was unable to resist the stranger's commands, and I was trapped in a world of darkness and despair. It was as if my entire existence had been consumed by the stranger's influence. Despite my fear, I continued to follow the stranger's instructions, driving deeper and deeper into the night. I had no idea where we were going or what the stranger's ultimate goal was. All I knew was that I was in deep trouble and that there was no way out. As we drove on, I felt a sense of transformation coming over me. It was as if the stranger's influence was slowly changing me, turning me into someone or something else entirely. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I was no longer the person I had been when I started this journey. Eventually, we came to a stop in the middle of the desert. The stranger got out of the car and motioned for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, but then found myself getting out of the car and following him into the darkness. As we walked deeper into the desert, I felt a sense of dread building inside of me. I had no idea where we were going or what the stranger had in store for me, but I knew that it wasn't going to be good. Finally, we arrived at a small shack in the middle of nowhere. The stranger motioned for me to go inside, and I found myself obeying his command without hesitation. Inside the shack, I found myself surrounded by darkness and silence. The stranger was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel his presence all around me. It was as if he was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. As the hours wore on, I found myself growing increasingly desperate to escape. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to break free of the stranger's influence. I was trapped in a waking nightmare with no way out. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, I realized that I was never going to escape. The stranger had won, and I was forever changed by this experience. I was left with a sense of terror and dread that would stay with me for the rest of my life. The sound of the train chugging along the tracks lulled me to sleep, and I snuggled closer to my girlfriend. We were on an interrail journey through Europe, visiting cities like London, Paris, and Barcelona. I had always wanted to take her on a trip like this, and seeing her happy made my heart swell with pride. As we got off the train in each new city, my girlfriend would ooh and ah at the tourist spots, but I wasn't interested in that. I had found some intriguing urban exploration sites online, and that's what I was looking forward to the most. My girlfriend wasn't as excited about that, but I promised her we'd still see the famous landmarks. As we headed to Frankfurt, I knew we had a lot to explore. My girlfriend was excited to see the Goethe House, but I wanted to check out some of the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of the city. I found a place somewhere outside the city that looked promising, so we took a train and then walked to the location. It was a chilly day, and my girlfriend was shivering in her coat. But she smiled as she saw the building and seemed happy to be there with me. I couldn't help but feel proud that I had found something unique for us to explore. We walked around the perimeter, and I showed her where the entrance was. "Are you sure it's safe?" she asked, and I shrugged it off. "It'll be fine. Trust me," I said, taking her hand. We walked inside, and I could tell my girlfriend was a little nervous. I held her close and tried to make her feel safe. As we explored the building, we found some creepy things, like old medical equipment and jars of strange fluids. But my girlfriend seemed more interested in the architecture, so we took some photos. As we were about to leave, I told her to wait for a moment while I checked out a room I had noticed earlier. It was a small space, and I had to crouch to get inside. I opened a small box and took out a package, which I carefully placed in a shallow pit outside. "See?" I whispered. "I told you I'd take you everywhere." My girlfriend didn't seem to notice anything strange and just smiled, holding my hand. We headed back to the train station, but something inside me had shifted. I was feeling more possessive, more in love with her than ever before. I wanted to keep her close to me, to make sure she never left my side. As we settled back into our seats on the train, I pulled her closer and kissed her forehead. She looked up at me and smiled, but I could tell something was off. Maybe it was just my paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few days after our trip to Frankfurt, my girlfriend went missing. She had gone out for a walk, and when she didn't return, I started to panic. I searched everywhere for her, but she was nowhere to be found. The police were called, and I was taken in for questioning. They asked me if I had noticed anything strange about her behavior before she disappeared, and I told them that everything seemed fine. I was worried sick, and I wanted to do everything I could to find her. As the days passed, the police found evidence that I had been keeping a diary of her every move during the trip. They were suspicious of my behavior, and I couldn't blame them. I was desperate to find my girlfriend, and I had been keeping track of every place we visited and every move she made. When the police searched my house, they found a secret room filled with my girlfriend's belongings. I had been collecting things that belonged to her, including her hair, clothes, and jewelry. I knew it seemed strange, but I couldn't help myself. I loved her so much, and I wanted to keep her close to me. The police finally discovered the diary, and it revealed the depth of my obsession with my girlfriend. I had been stalking and obsessing over her for months before the trip, and I had planned every detail of our journey together. I had even chosen the locations for our urban exploration, knowing that it would make her happy. I was arrested and taken into custody. I couldn't believe what was happening. I loved my girlfriend so much, and I would never hurt her. I told the police that I had no idea where she could be, but they didn't believe me. The evidence against me was mounting, and it looked like I had killed her. Days turned into weeks, and I was locked up in a cell. I couldn't sleep or eat. The guilt was eating me alive. I loved my girlfriend so much, and now she was gone. The police wouldn't let me see her family or talk to anyone. I was all alone, and it was driving me crazy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the police found a shallow pit somewhere outside Frankfurt. They discovered my girlfriend's body buried there, and I was devastated. They had found her left hand chopped off, and it was left in the pit as a sick reminder of our trip together. I couldn't believe what had happened. I loved my girlfriend so much, and I would never hurt her. But now, she was gone, and I was alone. The memory of her haunted me, and I knew I would never be the same again. After the discovery of my girlfriend's body, I was charged with murder and kidnapping. I knew I was innocent, but the evidence against me was overwhelming. I was locked up, and the memory of my girlfriend haunted me every day. The trial was quick, and I was found guilty. I was sentenced to life in prison, and I knew I would never see the outside world again. I couldn't believe what had happened. I had loved my girlfriend so much, and now she was gone. The memory of her haunted me, and I knew I would never be able to forget what I had done. The memory of her severed left hand in the shallow pit outside Frankfurt haunted me every day. It was a sick reminder of our trip together, and I knew that I had destroyed the life of the person I loved most in the world. As I sat in my cell, I thought about my girlfriend and what I had done to her. I knew that I had let my love turn into an unhealthy obsession. I had been so obsessed with keeping her close to me that I had destroyed her life and mine. I couldn't forgive myself for what I had done. The memory of my girlfriend's body buried in the shallow pit outside Frankfurt haunted me. I knew that I had taken her life, and I would never be able to make it right. The guilt was eating me alive, and I couldn't live with the thought of what I had done. Years turned into decades, and I was still locked up. The memory of my girlfriend haunted me every day, and I knew that I would never be able to forget what I had done. I had let my love turn into an obsession, and it had destroyed everything I had ever cared about. As I lay dying in my cell, I thought about my girlfriend and what I had done to her. I knew that I had destroyed her life, and I would never be able to make it right. The memory of her haunted me, and I knew that I would never be able to forget what I had done. The memory of her severed left hand in the shallow pit outside Frankfurt would haunt me forever. I had let my love turn into an obsession, and it had destroyed everything I had ever cared about. As I took my last breath, I knew that I would never be able to make it right. I remember the night watch duty like it was yesterday. The darkness was thick, and the only sounds were the distant echoes of explosions and the occasional whirring of a plane overhead. I was on my own, keeping watch over the trench lines. My fellow soldiers had all settled down for the night, trying to get some rest before the next day's battle. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard footsteps approaching me. I thought it was one of my fellow soldiers coming to check on me, so I stood up to greet them. But instead of a friendly face, I saw a shadow moving towards me. The shadow was dark and ominous, its shape shifting with each step it took. I reached for my gun, but my hands were slick with sweat, and it slipped from my grasp, falling into the mud. The shadow enveloped me, and I felt a cold, clammy hand wrap around my throat. I gasped for air, struggling to break free, but the grip only tightened. As I struggled, I saw the faces of all the soldiers I'd fought beside flash before my eyes. Their expressions were hollow, and their eyes were empty. They silently accused me of surviving while they perished. The shadow tightened its grip, and I felt myself slipping away. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow released me, and I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was covered in a cold sweat. I knew then that what I'd experienced was no hallucination brought on by the stress of war. It was something else entirely. For the rest of the night, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting the shadow to return. But it didn't. When my fellow soldiers woke up the next morning, I told them what had happened, but they dismissed it as a nightmare brought on by the stress of war. But I knew the truth. I knew that the shadow was real, and it was coming for us all. From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that washed over me every time I was alone in the dark. The shadow had made its mark on me, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The war raged on, and I fought alongside my fellow soldiers. But every night, as I settled down for the night watch duty, the dread would set in. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then one night, as I was on watch, I saw it again. The shadow was moving towards me, and I knew that this time it was real. I tried to run, but the shadow followed me, its shape shifting with each step. As I ran, I could hear the whispers of my fallen comrades in the wind. Their voices were faint, but they were there, accusing me of surviving while they perished. I knew then that the shadow was not just a figment of my imagination, but a manifestation of my guilt and trauma. When my fellow soldiers found me curled up in a ball, sobbing, they tried to comfort me. But I knew that they couldn't understand. They hadn't seen what I'd seen or felt what I'd felt. After that night, the shadow appeared more frequently. It would linger just beyond the light, waiting for me to let my guard down. I could feel it watching me, a constant presence that never left. I became paranoid, seeing the shadow everywhere I went. It would take on the shape of my fallen comrades, staring at me with hollow eyes. I knew then that I was losing my grip on reality. One night, I was on watch duty with another soldier. He could see the fear in my eyes and asked me what was wrong. I hesitated, unsure if I should tell him, but in the end, I did. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss me as crazy. Instead, he listened, and then he told me his own story. He'd seen the shadow too, and he knew that it was real. We stayed up all night, talking about our experiences and sharing our fears. It was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone. The shadow was still there, but somehow it seemed less threatening. As the war came to an end, I knew that the shadow would never truly leave me. It had become a part of me, a reminder of the horrors I'd witnessed and the sins I'd committed. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. The other soldiers who'd fought beside me had seen the shadow too, and together we would find a way to live with it. When the war finally ended, I returned home, but the shadow came with me. It followed me wherever I went, a constant reminder of the darkness I'd faced. I tried to ignore it, to move on with my life, but it was always there, lurking just beyond the light. I became a recluse, unable to escape the shadow's grasp. I could see it in the faces of strangers, in the shadows of my own home, and even in my dreams. The whispers of my fallen comrades grew louder, and the sound of their screams haunted me even in my sleep. Years passed, and I grew old. The shadow was still there, a constant presence in my life. I knew that my time was running out, but I couldn't escape it. One day, my daughter found me dead, my face twisted in terror. The cause of death was unknown, but there were rumors of a shadow seen lurking around my home. The other soldiers who'd fought beside me heard of my death, and they knew what it meant. The shadow was not just a figment of our imagination, but a manifestation of our guilt and trauma. It was a legacy that we would all carry with us, a reminder of the horrors of war and the sacrifices made by so many. The other soldiers began to see the shadow too, and they knew that they were not alone. They knew that the shadow was a part of them, just as it had been a part of me. Together, we found a way to live with the shadow. We talked about it, shared our experiences, and supported each other through the darkness. We knew that the shadow would never truly leave us, but we also knew that we could find a way to live with it. And so, the shadow became a legacy, haunting not just me but all those who fought in the war. It was a reminder of the darkness that lies within all of us, and of the sacrifices made in the name of war. The shadow would continue to loom over us, a constant reminder of the horrors of war, but together we would face it. And though the war was over, the shadow would continue to follow us, a constant reminder of the price of freedom.